Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The COVID-19 vaccine that is being developed by the Oxford University in the United Kingdom has prompted a protective immune response in its early tests. See, as soon as the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, numerous institutions around the world began efforts to develop a vaccine. Amongst all these ongoing efforts towards the development of a vaccine, the most promising vaccine candidate happens to be the one that is being developed by Oxford University. This vaccine that has been tentatively named as the ChAd-Ox1 novel coronavirus 19 has been put through a series of early trials, and during these early stage trials, it has generated a positive immune response. See, during the early stage of the trials, the top priority is always on ensuring the safety of the vaccine. A secondary priority is to find out as to what kind of immune response is the vaccine generating. These early trials of the Oxford University vaccine has shown that the vaccine has led to only minor side effects such as fever and headache amongst the candidates who had been administered with the test vaccine. Experts have noted that these minor side effects can be easily managed with drugs such as paracetamol, and since the vaccine candidate has not led to any serious side effects, it has given some hope that we might finally have a viable vaccine against COVID-19 in a few months' time. The most promising thing to come out of these early trials is that the vaccine candidate has generated a strong dual immune response. During the trials, it has been observed that the patients who had volunteered not only managed to produce antibodies against COVID-19, but they also produced a strong T-cell response, which is critical to target the spike protein of the SARS coronavirus 2. See, the antibodies that our immune system produces, if it takes on the antigens and fights the infection, the T cells, which is a type of a lymphocyte that is a part of our white blood cells, directly targets the spike protein structure of the SARS coronavirus 2, which is responsible for latching on to the ACE2 receptors in our cells, thus providing an entry to the SARS coronavirus 2 to enter the cell structure. So the Oxford University's vaccine candidate has produced a dual immune response, and it has triggered the production of both antibodies against the infection and as well as T cells, which will help in directly targeting the spike protein structure of the SARS coronavirus 2. So this gives some hope that we might finally have a viable vaccine against COVID-19. But we should always remember that these are still early trials and there is still a long way to go before the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine is completely established. But nevertheless, the positive immune response produced during these early trials has generated a lot of excitement and interest amongst governments and as well as amongst the markets. Markets around the world have already started rallying on the hopes that this could be a viable vaccine, and governments are rushing to sign deals with Oxford University and the licensed pharmaceutical companies in order to mass produce the vaccine. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy and the United States have already signed deals to produce nearly 2 billion doses of this vaccine. And in the case of India, the Pune-based Serum Institute of India has signed a deal with AstraZeneca, which has been licensed by Oxford University, to bring this vaccine to India and begin human trials by August. If this vaccine does succeed, then priority would always be given to the most vulnerable, which includes the frontline workers such as doctors and nurses, and as well as the elderly population. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which deals with the topic of mob lynching. See, yesterday we had discussed that in the state of Assam, 3 people who were suspected to be Bangladeshi nationals were lynched by a mob based on the suspicion that they were involved in cattle smuggling. This horrific incident of mob lynching points to the complete breakdown of rule of law in Assam, and it adds to the series of mob lynching incidents that we have witnessed across the country over the last few years. Such repeating incidents of mob lynchings in the country points to the weakening of rule of law, and it is a result of the complete failure of the governance and law and order machinery of the state. See, for a society to have public order, its people must both fear the rule of law and have faith in the rule of law. When the people have the fear that if they violate the law, they would be punished, and if they have faith that justice would be delivered to them on the account of any injustice, Only then can such incidents be prevented, leading to the maintenance of public order. But in a society where people do not fear the rule of law and where they have lost faith in the rule of law, the people tend to take the law into their own hands, which results in incidents such as mob lynching. So by this logic, we can assume that incidents such as mob lynching takes place in those states and countries where the governance and law and order machinery has completely failed to maintain public order. This assumption holds very true for states such as Assam, because within a span of few weeks, this is the second such lynching incident that has been witnessed in Assam. This assumption can even be further corroborated with data, and the National Crime Record Bureau's report shows that Assam has one of the highest crime rates in the country, and it registers nearly 143 crimes per 1 lakh population. See, if you observe over the last few years, incidents of mob lynching have increased significantly in India and have been driven through the circulation of fake news on social media platforms. Reports show that most incidents of mob lynchings that have taken place over the last few years have been based on fake allegations that the victims who were targeted were involved either in cow slaughter or cattle smuggling or kidnapping of children. Even if these allegations were to be true, and even if the victims had committed these crimes as alleged, it still does not justify their lynching by the mob. An analysis of these incidents shows that most incidents of mob lynching took place on the basis of fake news circulated through social media, and many of these incidents had a communal angle to it. The editorial points out that the root cause of these incidents is the polarization promoted by the political class on divisive subjects such as religion, illegal migration, etc. The deliberate polarization of the society on these divisive lines enables the mob to lose their fear in the rule of law, and it emboldens them to take the matters into their own hands and target any individual on the mere basis of allegations and suspicion. And despite these increasing incidents of mob lynchings, the NCRB has failed to collect any separate data on mob lynchings in its 2017 report, which was published in 2019 after a 1-year delay. Currently, the NCRB continues to list mob lynching as any other act of murder, but this needs to change because mob lynching is not just any other act of murder, but it is a hate crime that is being committed by one section of the society against the other. See, as we discussed, lynchings have no place in a democratic civilized society, and it is an outcome of police inaction and the failure of governance to uphold and maintain public order and law and order. In the face of the failure of the police forces and the government to prevent such incidents, the only hope for the victims of mob lynching incidents and their families to seek justice and ensure accountability is to have a legal recourse. But in India, not only have the police forces failed to prevent such incidents, and not only has the governance machinery failed to uphold law and order, but there is also no effective legal recourse available to the victims and their families to seek justice and ensure accountability. See, in 2018, in the backdrop of rising mob lynching incidents, the Supreme Court had observed that such incidents represent an horrendous act of mobocracy. Basically, the Supreme Court had equated the Indian democracy with a mobocracy, where the mob had taken the law into its own hands, leading to the complete breakdown of the principle of rule of law. After making this alarming observation, the Supreme Court had laid down a few guidelines for the central government and the state governments, and it had directed them to come out with a specific law that deals with mob lynching incidents. Following these directions of the Supreme Court, Manipur became the first state in India to come out with a specific anti-mob lynching law, and Manipur was followed by Rajasthan and West Bengal. But the central government, on the other hand, has informed the Supreme Court that there is no need for a separate legislation because existing provisions under the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code are sufficient to deal with mob lynching incidents. See, the Ministry of Home Affairs has a valid argument over here because there are provisions under the IPC and CRPC to effectively deal with mob lynching incidents. There are provisions under these laws which allows mob lynching incidents to be treated as hate crime, and it does provide for exemplary punishment. But the problem is that the existing laws are not strictly enforced by the center and as well as by the state governments. It is this failure in enforcement, the failure of the governance machinery and police inaction, which has led to repeated incidents of mob lynching in the country, thereby threatening the principle of rule of law. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, which analyzes the proposed privatization of some services of the Indian Railways. See, until recently, the railway sector was placed entirely under the public domain because the Indian Railways is not just a transporter of passenger and goods, but it is also a strategic organization and a social welfare organization. It is a strategic organization because it functions as the backbone of the economy. It helps in moving millions of people around the country and in transporting freight from one industrial center to another. It also helps in connecting the raw materials with industrial centers, and it also helps in exports by connecting the production centers with nearby ports. The railways is also a strategic resource because it helps organizations such as the armed forces, the Central Armed Police Forces and the Election Commission of India to mobilize the security forces and their equipment around the country in the interest of maintaining law and order and upholding India's national security. More importantly, the railways is a social welfare organization because it helps millions of poor people to travel across the country, especially migrant workers, farmers, etc. And as the largest employer in India, it sustains the livelihood of lakhs of people. So considering how critical the railways is, it has always been retained under the public domain. But recently, the government has started to open up the railways for privatization, and it has already allowed the launch of private trains, and it has also proposed to open up few other services of the railways to the private sector. In this context, the column is of the opinion that the proposed privatization of few services of the Indian Railways could negatively affect maintenance, operations and welfare, and it labels the proposed reforms as a big reform that is on the wrong track. But instead of looking at just one side of the opinion, let us carry out a more balanced analysis wherein we evaluate both the pros and cons of the proposed privatization of the railways. See, even though the railways has been the backbone of the economy, and even though it has functioned well as a social welfare organization, it is quite infamous for its inefficiency and poor quality of services. So in this regard, introducing reforms in the railway sector and opening up the public sector to more privatization can bring in a number of advantages. The participation of private players can help the railways to induct modern technology. It can help the railways to provide better amenities and better facilities to the passengers and thereby improve passenger experience, which will help the railways to deliver a world-class experience to its customers. Greater privatization will also bring in greater efficiency and better managerial practices, and this will help in efficient on-time running of trains, and greater efficiency will also help in bringing down the operational and maintenance cost. Then greater privatization will also bring in more competition, which will provide more choice to the customer and automatically lead to an improvement in the quality of services. This theory of competition has been well established in public administration, and greater privatization of railways can definitely help in improving the quality of its services and bring in greater efficiency. But however, privatization, if not well executed, can have its own set of drawbacks as well. See, the biggest concern about privatization is that it might take away the social welfare nature of the railways, because the private sector is always driven by the profit motive, and this could lead to compromise in safety standards and as well as an unsubstantiated increase in prices. Any such irrational increase in ticket prices can make train travel unaffordable, especially for the weaker sections and the poor population, and it can severely restrict their ability to move across the country. And it is not just the passengers who would be affected, because any increase in the transportation cost of goods will directly translate to increased cost for the consumer. Then, in the interest of maintaining profitability, if the private sector compromises on operational and maintenance cost, this might dilute the safety standards of the railways, and it could potentially endanger lives as a result of accidents. The writers of the column also argue that privatization of the railways threatens to affect the livelihoods of lakhs of families that are dependent on the railway infrastructure, and they argue that If the government is looking at introducing modern technology and providing better facilities and amenities to the passenger, it can do this by promoting greater interaction between the public sector railways and the industry, and by providing a greater role to the IRCTC, which happens to be a government undertaking. The writers argue against the outsourcing of these critical functions to the private sector, and they say that a strategic sector such as the railways cannot be judged only on its ability to generate profits and return on investments. Because according to them, the railways in its current form is fulfilling a larger social goal, and even though there is definitely a need for reforms to improve the efficiency of the railways and the quality of its services, the writers argue that these changes must come from the public sector itself and not through privatization. But however, for the sake of a balanced analysis, we have looked at both the pros and cons of privatization, and this should help you write balanced answers in your mains examination. Then according to this article on page number 11, the new Consumer Protection E-Commerce Rules 2020 is set to come into effect next week. These new set of e-commerce rules that are being brought in by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs will place a new set of obligations on e-commerce portals. As per these rules that are being notified under the Consumer Protection Act, the e-commerce portals will be responsible for setting up a robust consumer redressal mechanism through which all the grievances of the consumers can be addressed by the e-commerce portals in a time-bound manner. As per the new rules, the e-commerce platforms will have to acknowledge the receipt of any consumer complaint within 48 hours. And they need to address this complaint and resolve the complaint within a period of 1 month, and they will also have to appoint a grievance redressal officer. The new rules also prohibits the e-commerce companies from unfairly profiting through the manipulation of prices. It also mandates the e-commerce portals to mandatorily list the country of origin of every product that is sold on the portal in order to enable the consumer to make an informed choice based on the origin of the product that they are buying on the portal. This rule has been inserted in order to promote greater localization and help the consumer choose local products over imported products. The new rules also place a mandatory obligation on the sellers as well. The sellers who are utilizing these e-marketplaces or e-commerce platforms, they cannot refuse to take back the goods, or they cannot refuse to issue refunds in case the goods or services offered by them are defective and deficient. Then finally, please note that these new rules are not just advisory in nature, but they are mandatory, and this would be the first time such strict regulation guidelines are being enforced on India's e-commerce sector. Then according to this article on page number 11, Indian naval ships have had a rendezvous with American Carrier Strike Group, and they have conducted a passage exercise or a PASEX while the US aircraft carrier and its battle strike group was passing near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands of India. This passage exercise between India and US comes at a time when China has increased its naval deployment in the South China Sea and as well as in the Indian Ocean region. See, over the last few years, India in particular has been concerned about the increasing Chinese naval presence in the IOR region. Especially after China opened a naval base in Djibouti, it has increased the presence of its naval ships and submarines in the IOR region in the name of conducting anti-piracy patrols. While India has been watching these developments closely, China has stepped up tensions in the South China Sea through increased military confrontation with Southeast Asian countries, and in response, the United States has increased its deployment of aircraft carriers and carrier strike groups in the interest of enforcing a rules-based order which will help in maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and help promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Then we have another article on page number 11 which refers to the Chardham highway project. See, the actual Chardham Yatra refers to a holy pilgrimage in Hinduism that involves travel to 4 sacred pilgrimage sites, including the Badrinath temple in Uttarakhand, the Puri Jagannath temple in Odisha, the Ramnath Swami temple in Rameshwaram, and the Dwarkadish temple in Dwarka, that is in Gujarat. But the article on page number 11 and its reference to the Chardham highway project actually refers to the Chota Chardham Yatra in Uttarakhand. This is also a sacred pilgrimage in Hinduism, which includes travelling to 4 sacred pilgrimage sites located at Yamunotri, Gangotri, Kedarnath and Badrinath. In 2016, Prime Minister Modi laid the foundation stone for an ambitious project to connect these pilgrimage centers with a highway and railway project in order to facilitate easier travel for the pilgrims. But the proposed Chardham highway project has run into a number of controversies, mainly on environmental grounds, because of the fragile ecosystem of Uttarakhand. So in order to address these environmental concerns and in order to decide upon the width of these roads, the Supreme Court had set up a high-powered committee, and according to this article, the high-powered committee has submitted its report, and through the report it has emerged that the panel members have taken a split decision with regard to increasing the width of these roads and balancing the environmental concerns. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Under the Constitution, the Parliament or the Legislature has the powers to enact laws covering general principles and policies and leaves detailed rule making to the government to allow for expediency and flexibility. The government is required to frame the rules in accordance with the policy laid down by the Parliament or the Legislature. Such rules are called as subordinate legislation. All the three statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. See, under the Indian Constitution, it is the Parliament and the Legislature which have been empowered to pass laws. But these laws passed by the Parliament and the Legislature deal with broad policies. They usually do not contain the specific rules, which are commonly referred to as bylaws, orders, notifications, etc. After a broad legislation is passed by the Parliament or the Legislature, they usually delegate the task of coming out with the specific rules and bylaws to the executive itself, that is the government. So basically, this is a case where the executive that is responsible for the administration of laws is also given the responsibility for drafting the specific rules and bylaws. So in a way, the executive is also playing the role of the legislature. Such law making by the government with the approval of the Parliament or the Legislature is referred to as subordinate legislation or delegated legislation. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The powers to regulate and control the development and management of groundwater resources in the country lies with the Central Groundwater Authority. It has been constituted under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. It functions under the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect. So option B is the right answer. See, the Central Groundwater Authority functions under the Ministry of Jal Shakti, not under the Ministry of Environment. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 4 which makes a reference to the Central Groundwater Authority under the Ministry of Jal Shakti. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which port happens to be India's largest container port in terms of capacity? The correct answer is JNPT Mumbai. Option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 5, two new logistic units have begun operations at the Special Economic Zone that is located adjacent to the JNPT port in Mumbai, which happens to be India's largest container port. Now let's take up the next practice question. India procured the T-90 Bhishma battle tank from Russia. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the Ministry of Defence has signed a contract with Bharat Earth Movers Limited in order to procure mine plows for the T-90 battle tanks that India has procured from Russia. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? An unmanned probe named as Hope is the first Arab space mission to Mars developed by UAE. It was successfully launched on ISRO's GSLV launch vehicle. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect, so option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, the Arab region's first mission to Mars that has been named as Hope and which has been developed by the United Arab Emirates has been launched successfully by the Japanese Space Agency and not by ISRO. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Financial Reporting Authority was constituted in 2018 under the Companies Act of 2013. Its primary function is to recommend accounting and auditing policies and standards to be adopted by companies for approval by the central government and monitor and enforce compliance with accounting standards and auditing standards. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 15, the National Financial Reporting Authority has constituted a technical advisory committee in order to suggest reforms to the auditing and accounting standards. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Which one of the following books of ancient India has the love story of the son of the founder of Sunga dynasty? The correct answer is option B. It is the Malvikagni Mitra, which is a Sanskrit play written by Kalidasa. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: repeated incidents of mob lynching in the country points to a breakdown of the rule of law in several states. Evaluate. The second question: critically analyze the impact of planned privatization of some services of the Indian Railways. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.